For 4 days, the bowl remained empty. It was a simple, celadon-glazed piece of ceramic, chosen by his sister for its understated elegance. Each day, a new meal was placed within it: seared wagyu, delicate tamagoyaki, clear fish broth with slivers of yuzu, and each day, the meal was taken away untouched. Ryusei Kudo sat in the back booth of the quiet cafe he owned, a ghost at his own table. He was the Oyabun of the Kudokai, a man whose quietest whisper could flood a city block with his men or drain the life from a rival's enterprise. He controlled the ports, the unions, the concrete that built the city's new towers. But for 96 hours, he had been rendered powerless by grief, a force more absolute than any enemy syndicate. His men stood like statues at the cafe's entrance, their dark suits a funereal uniform. His sister, Hannah, sat opposite him, her posture perfect, her face a mask of strained patience. "Brother," she said, her voice a silken thread in the heavy silence. "You must eat. The family needs its strength." What she meant was, "I need you to stop this. Your weakness is becoming a liability." Ryusei did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the space just above the bowl, the space where his wife Misaki would have been sitting, laughing about the overpriced coffee. The cafe, the Gilded Bean, had been her project, her little piece of normalcy in their gilded cage. Now it was his mausoleum. From across the room, near the clatter of the espresso machine, a young woman watched. Her name was Anise. She was 18, a new hire, and she was not supposed to be watching. She was supposed to be wiping down counters, refilling sugar shakers, and staying invisible. She wore a simple light pink server's dress, the fabric thin, and a crisp white apron tied neatly at her waist. She had seen the expensive food come and go. She had heard the hushed, urgent conversations between the manager and the men in suits. She knew, with the instinct of someone who had known real hunger, that this was not about the quality of the food. It was about something else entirely. She watched Hannah leave the table, her movements sharp with frustration. She watched Ryusei stare at the empty air. And then, she made a decision that would either get her fired or change everything. She untied her apron, laid it on a clean counter, and walked into the kitchen. The reason for Ryusei's starvation was a matter of public record and private agony. 11 days ago, Misaki's car had been hit by a truck that ran a red light. The official report called it a tragic accident. The driver was a nobody, drunk at 10 in the morning. But Ryusei knew the intricate mechanics of his world. He knew there were no true accidents, only failures of foresight. He had built an empire of information, of surveillance, of absolute control, designed for one purpose above all others: to keep her safe. And it had failed. The truck was from a shipping company owned by a minor rival, a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. The connection was too thin to be proof, but too thick to be coincidence. It was a message. A sloppy, brutal, devastatingly effective message. His grief was not the soft, weeping kind. It was a cold, hard fury directed entirely at himself. He was a god in his own dominion, yet he had failed to prevent a simple, crude act of physics. He replayed the timeline 1,000 times a day. If he had insisted she take his driver. If he had called her 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later. If he had never underestimated the ambition of a small man. Each thought was a turn of the screw. His home, once filled with her music and the scent of the flowers she arranged, was now a silent, sterile vault. He slept in a guest room because the indentation her body had left on her side of the bed felt like a physical accusation. Hannah, his younger sister, had stepped into the vacuum. She was brilliant, ruthless, and understood the family business better than anyone. She saw his grief not as a wound to be healed, but as a breach in their defenses. Her love for him was real, but it was braided tightly with a desperate, pragmatic need for survival. Every plate of food she brought him, every plea, was a strategic move. "The elders are asking questions," she would say. Or, "The O'Malleys smell blood in the water." She was trying to remind him of his duty, of the throne he was leaving vacant. But every reminder of his power was a reminder of his failure. The food she brought was a symbol of his status, complex, expensive, demanding. It was food for a king. But he no longer felt like one. He felt like the man who had let his queen die. In the kitchen, the head chef, Marco, was plating a delicate panna cotta. He saw Anis walk past the dish pit and start pulling vegetables from the walk-in cooler. Carrots, onions, a few stalks of celery. He wiped his hands on his apron, his expression annoyed. "Hey, new girl. What do you think you're doing?" Anis didn't stop. She moved with a quiet, determined focus. "The cooks have been trying for 4 days," Marco continued, his voice low and sharp. "He sends everything back. Do you think he wants whatever it is you're making?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm. "He doesn't want the cook's food," she said, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't a criticism, it was an observation. She placed the vegetables on a cutting board and picked up a heavy chef's knife. Her hands were steady. She was a waitress. A pre-med student at the city college, surviving on scholarships, ramen, and sheer will. She had never cooked in a professional kitchen in her life. But she knew this. She knew the hollow space grief carves out in a person's stomach. When her own mother had passed 2 years prior, Anis had forgotten what food tasted like for a month. Her grandmother had been the one to break the spell. She hadn't brought fancy dishes or begged her to eat. She had simply placed a bowl of thick, plain beef stew in front of her, the kind of food that doesn't ask you to celebrate or perform. The kind of food that simply says, "You are alive. This will keep you that way." Anis began to chop the onions, the rhythm of the knife against the board filling the tense kitchen. She found a cut of beef in the cooler, not a prime cut, but something tough that would soften with time. She browned it in a heavy-bottomed pot, the smell rich and unpretentious. The other kitchen staff stopped what they were doing to watch her. It was an act of profound insubordination. She was a waitress, an outsider, a child. And she was cooking for the oyabun. They expected her to be thrown out. But as the stew simmered, a new scent began to fill the kitchen, displacing the refined aromas of truffle oil and saffron. It was the simple, honest smell of a home. Anis ladled the stew into a plain, heavy ceramic bowl from the staff shelf, not the fine china used for reuse. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of slow-cooked beef and softened root vegetables. There was no garnish, no artistic drizzle of oil. It was just stew. She picked up the bowl, her hands protected by a folded cloth, and walked out of the kitchen. The hushed atmosphere of the cafe seemed to intensify as she approached the back booth. Every eye was on her, the guards at the door, the manager hovering by the bar, and Hannah, who had just returned to the table. Hannah saw the plain bowl and the girl in the faded pink dress, and her perfectly composed face hardened with contempt. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence. "Take that back to the kitchen." Anis did not look at Hannah. Her focus was entirely on the man sitting in the booth. She moved past his sister as if she weren't there and gently placed the bowl on the table in front of Ryusei, the spot where every other dish had been rejected. She set a simple, heavy spoon beside it. And then she stepped back, waiting. Not with defiance. Not with hope. Just waiting. A full minute passed. The tick of the large clock on the wall was the only sound. Ryusei's men shifted their weight, their hands inching closer to the jackets of their suits. Hannah's breath was a sharp, angry hiss. She was about to call for security, to have this insolent girl removed. But then, something happened. Ryusei moved. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes, which had been vacant and unfocused for days, blinked and then settled on the bowl. He saw the chunks of carrot, the pieces of potato, the dark, rich broth. He inhaled. The scent was not complex or challenging. It was foundational. It smelled like a memory he couldn't quite place. He looked past the bowl, at the young woman standing a few feet away. He saw her worn-out shoes, the slight tremble in her hands, the quiet dignity in her posture. She was not offering him a tribute. She was offering him sustenance. Without a word, without looking at his sister, Ryusei Kudo picked up the spoon. The food Hannah had brought him was a performance. It was a culinary reminder of his identity, the bluefin sashimi, a testament to his control of the docks. The rare sake, a nod to his heritage and purity of taste. The Kobe beef, a symbol of his wealth and power. Each dish was an argument, a persuasion. Each one said, "Remember who you are. Come back to us." And so he had rejected them all, because he no longer knew who that man was. The man who was supposed to be infallible, who was supposed to be a protector, had failed. He could not eat the food of a king when he felt like a fraud. Anis's stew was an entirely different language. It was anonymous, humble, and deeply sincere. It was not food for the Oyabun. It was food for a man. It asked nothing of him. It did not demand he return to power or reassure his followers. It simply offered warmth and substance, a tether to the physical world he had begun to drift away from. As he brought the first spoonful to his lips, the taste unlocked a memory so vivid it made him pause. He was 20 years old, not a boss, but a low-level enforcer, living in a tiny apartment with Misaki. He had just come home after a brutal night, a deal gone wrong that had left him with a split lip and a bruised ego. He had felt like a failure then, too. Misaki hadn't said much. She had taken his face in her hands, cleaned the cut on his lip, and then disappeared into their small kitchen. She had returned with a bowl of stew, almost identical to this one. She had made it from cheap ingredients and leftovers, but it had tasted like salvation. "Even strong men need to eat," she had whispered, pushing the bowl toward him. He looked up from the stew in front of him, back into the present. He saw Anis, still standing there, a girl he had never seen before, who had somehow channeled the ghost of his wife's kindness. She couldn't have known. It was a coincidence, an accident of empathy. But in Ryusui's world, there were no coincidences. He ate every last bit, the scrape of his spoon against the ceramic the only sound. Hannah watched, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, relief that he was eating, fury that this girl had succeeded, and a cold, sharp calculation as she realized this stranger now held a piece of leverage she did not. Ryusui placed the spoon down gently beside the empty bowl. The small, distinct sound broke the spell in the cafe. For the first time in days, the silence felt less like a weight and more like a space waiting to be filled. He looked directly at Anis, his gaze sharp and assessing, the fog of his grief finally receding. The eyes that met hers were not cruel, but they held an unnerving intensity, the look of a man who sees everything. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. He simply acknowledged her existence with his full attention, and in his world, that was more significant than any polite phrase. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Anis," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper, yet it carried in the stillness. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, committing the name to memory. Then, he turned his head and looked at his sister. The shift was immediate. The brief moment of human connection vanished, replaced by the cool, unquestionable authority of the Oyabun. "Leave us," he said. The words were quiet, but they were not a request. Hannah froze. She, his sister, his second in command, was being dismissed in favor of a waitress. A wave of humiliation and anger washed over her face before being suppressed behind her mask of perfect composure. "Brother, I don't think now." He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single word was a steel door slamming shut. Without another word, Hannah stood, her back ramrod straight. She gave Anis a look of pure, unadulterated poison before turning and walking out of the cafe, her heels clicking like gunshots on the polished floor. Now they were alone in the vast, empty room, save for the silent guards at the door. Anis stood by the table, unsure of what to do. The dynamic between them was strange and unsettling. He was a figure of immense power, a man whispered about in fear, but she was the one who had just watched him eat from a bowl she had prepared. She had seen a crack in his armor. The silence stretched, no longer empty, but charged with unspoken meaning. If you've ever felt a grief so deep it stole your hunger, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. This next part is for you. Ryusui studied Anis for a long moment, taking in the frayed hem of her pink dress and the resolute set of her jaw. He saw not just a girl, but a specific kind of strength, the quiet, stubborn resilience of someone who had weathered storms of her own. He had made a decision in the time it took him to finish the stew. The old ways were not working. His sister's strategic care felt like a cage. His chef's elaborate meals felt like a mockery. This girl, this complete stranger, had given him something real. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the one Hannah had just vacated. Hesitantly, Anis sat down, perching on the edge of the leather seat. "You are a student," he stated. It wasn't a question. He already knew. His organization had run a cursory background check on every employee of the cafe the day he bought it for Misaki. He knew she was at City College, studying biology. He knew her financial aid was precarious. "Yes," she said. "I will pay for your education," Ryusei said, his tone flat and transactional. "All of it. And you will receive a monthly salary, 5 times what you make here." Anis's eyes widened. It was a life-changing amount of money. It was the answer to prayers she had been too tired to even utter. It was freedom from the constant, gnawing anxiety about rent and tuition. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that it was not free. She waited for the other shoe to drop. "In return," he continued, "you will cook for me. 1 meal a day. Here." After the cafe closes to the public, her heart began to beat faster. It was an offer she couldn't refuse, not just because of the money, but because of the man making it. Refusing a man like Ryusei Kudo was not a simple no, it was an insult. An act of defiance that could have unforeseen consequences. Yet accepting meant stepping willingly into his world, a world of shadows, violence, and unspoken rules. She would no longer be just a waitress. She would be his. In some small, specific way. She looked at his hands, which were resting on the table. They were elegant, with long fingers and immaculately clean nails, but she could imagine them doing terrible things. Right now, however, they were just the hands of a man who had been hungry. That was the only version of him she truly knew. Her need outweighed her fear. Her dream of becoming a doctor, of giving her family a better life, was more powerful than the danger she could only guess at. "Okay," she said. The single word sealed the pact. The Gilded Bean Cafe was no longer just a cafe. It had become a territory, a sanctuary, and now a gilded cage of her own. The new routine began the next evening. At precisely 10 o'clock, the last of the regular customers would leave, and the manager would lock the front doors. Ryusei's men, 2 silent figures named Taka and Shin, would sweep the premises, their movements economical and precise. They would secure the entrances, check the sight lines from the street, and then melt back into the shadows, becoming part of the cafe's architecture. The bustling public space would transform into a silent, private chamber. Anis would change out of her uniform and into her own clothes, but she would keep the white apron on. It felt like a shield. In the vast, gleaming kitchen, she would cook. She never made anything complicated. She made the food of her childhood, the food of necessity and comfort. Thick lentil soup. Simple roasted chicken with potatoes. A hearty pasta with a slow-simmered tomato sauce. Food that was honest and nourishing. They established a ritual that was built almost entirely on silence. She would bring the meal to his booth, setting it down gently. She would pour him a glass of water. Then she would retreat to the kitchen and clean, giving him his space. He would eat slowly, deliberately. When he was finished, he would leave the empty bowl and plate on the table and depart through a private back exit. Only then would she return to clear the table. For weeks, they exchanged no more than a dozen words. Yet, a strange intimacy began to grow in the quiet spaces between their actions. He started leaving things on the table for her. The first time, it was a thick, leather-bound textbook on organic chemistry. It was a new edition, far more expensive than the used one she was struggling with. She never mentioned it, and neither did he. She simply took it. The next week, it was a small, potted orchid, its blooms a deep, velvety purple. It was for the counter in the kitchen, he had implied with its placement. In return, she began leaving something for him. A small slice of apple cake she had baked. A thermos of hot tea to take with him into the cold night. They were small, silent gestures. Gifts of recognition. He was no longer just the terrifying Oyabun. He was the man who liked her lemon cookies. And she was no longer just an employee. She was the person who knew he preferred his soup very hot. From a distance, Hannah watched this quiet domesticity with a growing sense of alarm. She saw her brother's fortress of grief being dismantled, not by a show of strength, but by a girl with a soup bowl. She saw this tenderness not as healing, but as a fatal vulnerability, an infection in the system. And so, she began to do what she did best. She had a niece investigated, not just a cursory background check, but a deep, invasive dive into her entire life. Hannah's investigators were ruthlessly efficient. They unearthed every vulnerability in a niece's life with surgical precision. They found her apartment, a small 2-bedroom in a rough neighborhood she shared with her younger brother, Samuel. They found Samuel's medical records, a chronic respiratory condition that required expensive medication and regular doctor's visits. They found the mountain of hospital bills that a niece's salary, even her new, inflated one, could barely touch. Hannah had found the leverage point. She understood that a direct confrontation with Ryusei would be a catastrophic mistake. He would see it as a challenge to his authority and would defend a niece simply on principle. The attack had to be indirect. It had to come from the outside, looking like the random chaos of the world Ryusei was supposed to command. She made a single, untraceable phone call to a subordinate clan, one that owed the Kudokai a favor. She didn't give an order. She simply made an observation. She noted that a rival gang had been getting bold, selling their narcotics on a corner 3 blocks from Anissa's apartment. She suggested that such disrespect needed to be addressed. Publicly. Violently. 2 nights later, the corner erupted. A dispute over territory escalated into a full-blown firefight. Stray bullets shattered the window of the bodega on the ground floor of Anissa's building. 2 people were killed. It had nothing to do with Anise, and yet it had everything to do with her. The violence was a message delivered not to her, but to Ryusei. The message was clear: this is the world you live in. When you bring an outsider into it, you paint a target on their back. Her weakness is now your weakness. Ryusei heard about the incident within minutes. His network was absolute. He knew which crews were involved. And with a sickening certainty, he knew who had lit the fuse. He knew it was Hannah's work. He recognized her style, the elegant, deniable brutality. The tender, fragile space he and Anise had built within the walls of the cafe had been breached. The danger of his life, the very thing he had tried to shield Misaki from, was now seeping into Anisa's world. And it was his fault. He had brought this plague to her doorstep. Make sure you're subscribed, because what Hannah does next changes everything. That night, Anise arrived at the cafe looking pale and unnerved. The lingering glow of police lights had colored her walk to the bus stop. The sounds of sirens were still echoing in her ears. She tried to hide it, to maintain the quiet composure that had become their norm, but her hands trembled slightly as she chopped vegetables in the kitchen. She made a simple chicken soup, the kind of food one makes when the world feels cold and dangerous. She carried the bowl to the booth, her steps less certain than usual. Ryusei was already there, sitting in the shadows. He watched her approach, his face an unreadable mask. He saw the fear she was trying to conceal. He saw the faint, dark circles under her eyes. She placed the bowl of soup in front of him. The aroma of chicken, broth, and dill filled the space between them. On any other night, it would have been a comfort. Tonight, it smelled like a liability. He looked from her frightened face to the soup, and he made a terrible choice. He did not pick up his spoon. The rejection was a physical blow. Anise flinched. For weeks, this ritual had been their only form of communication. His eating was acceptance, approval, connection. His refusal was a severing. "You cannot come here anymore," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, delivered like a final judgment. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a desperate act of protection. The narrator of this story understands what he meant. He was exiling her from his world to save her from it. He was choosing to be hungry and alone again if it meant she would be safe. But Anise didn't hear the subtext. She heard only the surface meaning. She was being fired. She had done something wrong. The fragile ground she had found beneath her feet crumbled. Is the food not right?" she stammered, her voice cracking. "It is not safe for you," he said, the words clipped. He gave her no comfort, no explanation. He couldn't. To show her his fear for her would be to admit his own weakness, to reveal the threat his own family posed. Beneath the table, his hand clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. He slid a thick, white envelope across the table. It landed softly next to the soup bowl. "This will cover your tuition and your brother's expenses for 2 years," he said. Go, a niece stared at the envelope. It was her dream, materialized in paper. It was security. It was a future. But it felt like a payoff. A final transaction to end their silent arrangement. She was torn between the overwhelming relief the money offered and the sharp, sudden pain of his rejection. The soup sat between them, a final, uneaten offering, its steam dissipating into the cold air. At the far end of the cafe, a door to the back office opened. A figure was silhouetted in the doorway. It was Hannah. A small, triumphant smile played on her lips as she watched the girl's world fall apart. The empire was safe. The weakness had been excised. And Ryusei Aikudo was alone once more, hollowed out by a love he could only express through distance.